Okay, ladies and gentlemen, called back to order. I should probably note that sitting in the audience is an internationally known athlete, Mr. Eric Nickel, who works for the Delta Stewardship Council. He completed the Boston Marathon in record time, with 2 hours and 7 minutes or something like that, Mr. Nickel? Something like that. Give or take 2 hours. And the temperature was 89 degrees, 80 degrees, something like that. A major accomplishment. We're glad he's back, surviving. All right. Okay. Mr. Grindstaff.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to pass around language, and I'm sorry they don't have a regular copy machine. You can pay to get copies made here, but I got enough copies for the council, and you asked me before lunch to propose language, so I am bringing back some draft language that I think accomplishes the objective that we have.
I know this is not your handwriting because I can read it. Whose handwriting is this?
That shows good sense in managing the delegation process and having my chief deputy write it. Okay. The first objective is to shine a spotlight on water quality. I think that's one of the things that I heard loud and clear from everybody was that it was important and that we wanted to shine a spotlight on it. And so the first is a recommendation that water quality in the Delta should be maintained at a level that supports and enhances beneficial uses identified in the applicable state or regional water quality control plans or water quality plans. I don't think we say that as clearly as that in the plan, and so this would be a clear statement that we need to weave into the narrative and that we need to make as a clear directive moving ahead. Second is a recommendation that proposed actions identify significant impacts to water quality. So it says what we were saying as a policy, as a recommendation. We have the ability, almost anything that's going to be a covered action is going to have water quality impacts. We have this recommendation. I think we can evaluate it. They are required to comply with the law, and that is a requirement already in the Delta plan. So, but I think this lets people know, again, that it's important. And then the last recommendation is that the state board or regional board, as appropriate, should evaluate and, if appropriate, propose special water quality protections for ecosystem restoration opportunity areas, for areas near municipal water supply intakes or other areas of the Delta where new or increased discharges of pollutants could impact beneficial uses.
Joe, do you think the state or regional boards will be swayed by this?
Yeah, actually I do. One of the things that I have observed in the last year and a half is that they are paying significant attention to what we do, even in the form of recommendations, and in fact are willing to change their priorities based on what we recommend. Surprisingly, not just the regional boards and the state board, but also DWR, Department of Fish and Game. I think it will have an impact on how they approach the matter. And I think in addition to this, we need to pay attention and highlight this as one of the issues we need to follow closely over the next few years to evaluate its impact. And so that when the next Delta plan comes up, we can see how effective these recommendations have been.
Okay. Questions? Felicia, did you?
No, I think it's fine. It's probably more prudent at this time to go with this and then just flag somewhere that we're going to monitor it and see if we need to do more. I think that's a more prudent approach, so that I'm okay.
Okay. Questions? Don?
Yeah. Well, certainly the idea of recommendations, I think, is much more satisfactory. As I've thought about this, certainly heard some of the dialogue and explanations and conversations this morning, earlier today. I just wanted to ask about this, the last one, Joe. It kind of goes to just before we took the lunch break. And again, I think you've inserted should versus shall, which I think that also allows the opportunity for folks to, as described, to exercise hopefully discretion and judgment in looking at these issues. But where we talk about the ecosystem restoration opportunity areas, you kind of address that. Right now we have these large hash mark areas, maybe portions thereof that will be actually restoration areas.
Well, and that's why I wanted to say, if appropriate, because
Okay.
it's probably not appropriate to just arbitrarily say the entire area.
Okay.
But certainly, you could look and coordinate with the Department of Fish and Game and DWR. Where is restoration going to occur? Let's start now to protect that area from water quality problems that might occur that might prevent restoration.
Okay, so your qualifier is the if appropriate, or the qualifier
Yes.
in the sense that it, okay. Thanks.
Other comments, questions? Gloria,
I just want to move the motion
Okay.
for this one.
got a motion, second? Randy? Okay, can I ask a question, Dan, on your, the bottom paragraph? Is it areas near municipal water supply intakes? That's what I assume it is.
Yes, it is.
Near, okay, any area. And then second, in this language, do you think we have to, and this is a legal question, have to add the Suisun Marsh as a reference? I understand in the statute it's defined as jointly, but as we write. So you think that's sufficient to cover the Suisun Marsh as well? Oh,
Yes. I'm sorry. In the plan, we are defining the delta, so that's something that we need to make sure that
okay,
it covers it.
yeah,
But I think
some
it
places
does.
we say Delta and Suisun Marsh, but as long as it's included by this definition, that's okay. All right, comments, questions? We got a motion, we got a second, starting with Mr. Nordhoff.
Nornoff, aye.
Johnston, aye.
Ray, aye.
Marcus, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, a guy.
Totally high.
Okay. All right. Number two, or the second, rather, item. Mr. Ray?
Just to confirm, we didn't pass out all 5 copies, did we, or 7 copies? You got one?
Well, I have one.
Good, okay, just checking.
And I talked to our staff over there, and they know to get it from me afterwards. And I read it.
Mr. Ray?
Yes, okay, the second of these policies we held over, and really this is on page 7 of our staff report. And I think I'll talk a little bit about both B and C together, and then we can deal with them separately, but I want to introduce them that way. Again, this began with recommendations from the Delta Protection Commission's proposals to protect the Delta's place. And they proposed that the Delta plan should have a strong policy that would protect agricultural land. And they had recommended that to limit the loss of rural lands, that urban development and water facilities and ecosystem restoration projects and flood control projects should be consistent with existing general plans protecting agriculture. That they shouldn't proceed if they, except if they were using land from willing sellers, and the restoration project should select first lands that were already in existing public ownership. And the first challenge that raised for us, of course, is that if we put local government plans, gave them supremacy over state actions, we might well find ourselves unable, because of oppositions from the local agencies, to proceed with necessary ecosystem restoration and water management projects. And so we tried to separate that recommendation into 2 pieces, one about other land uses, and that is what we're recommending in DP1, locate new development wisely. And then the second, a policy that would deal with water management facilities and ecosystem restoration projects, essentially public works projects under DP2, where that's the one we've called respect local land use. So DP1 is a policy that would say, begins with why are we doing this? We want to limit the loss of rural lands to the greatest extent practical and protect opportunities for ecosystem restoration and reduce flood risks. And so then what's the policy? It's that new urban development, including residential, commercial, industrial uses, must be limited to areas that city and county general plans designate for development, either in the city or its sphere of influence, or in one of the legacy communities. Now, we've proposed 2 exclusions to that policy, and these both arise from the nature of rural uses in the Delta. One would be that visitors serving commercial recreation facilities, which include marinas and resorts that are scattered throughout the Delta outside of the cities and outside of the boundaries of legacy communities, would be a general exemption to this policy. And the second would be that facilities for processing local crops would be an exception for it, and that would assure that wineries and other processing facilities that might be located on farm, and some might think of as being a commercial or an industrial use, might also include, farm stands and things like that if for some reason people thought they were covered uses, would be assured of those kinds of locations.
Excuse me, Mr. Just a question, Dan, get a clarification on that. In the language on the visitor serving commercial recreational facilities, that has a little broader connotation. Understanding what you just explained, that's how I would understand it. As it relates to industrial commercial uses to process crops, that's very specific now, either that are supportive of agriculture. If I recall again the conversation from not just the commission, but the conversation that's been had in different forums, that those things that support the agricultural production in endeavors, and that may be firms that truck the crops that are located, and they're not all in the legacy towns. There may be outstation. You may have farm suppliers, and whether they be fertilizers and other applicable types of products. You may have tractor supplies, equipment supplies. Those things are generally allowed either in agricultural zones or require industrial zones if they're dependent upon the intensity. Was you envisioned that from a staff perspective that was included there or not? And if not, I would certainly like to have a conversation about that, because I think those, again, they're kind of speckled throughout the Delta, primary and secondary zone. But again, proximity, we've had this conversation before, I know you're well aware of it, proximity to some of those particular operations and the agricultural products that are being grown is very, very important in this day and age. And so, again, I don't think you haven't seen too many new ones of those. The wineries is the exception that you pointed out. We're actually seeing more wineries and wine tasting facilities and so forth being proposed and or built. So I just wanted to get the language that serve agriculture, and again, not to stretch it too far, but certainly to keep it in the category beyond just processing of the actual commodities, I think would be an important consideration in my view.
Okay. Yeah, and you see it on the county board, and Phil and others that have been involved in local government, I've seen it in other situations. Existing non-conforming uses are always sort of a challenge. You want to acknowledge that they're there. There's an interesting review in Planning Magazine just last week about how durable non-conforming uses are. When people first adopted zoning, they assumed they would go away rapidly, and it turns out they last for decades and generations if the operators are successful. And one of the reasons why are we trying to make sure development is located in cities? Well, one reason it's not just about protecting cropland; it's also about trying to have land uses that are resilient and aren't subject to flooding. And so, in general, I think you want to be saying, hey, if you can do this in town, yeah, that would be a better solution. But there's always that guy who's got an operation, working out of a shed on his property, and he wants to be able to expand it a little bit, and he's not ready to, relocate. And I think those things are going to, get worked out on a case-by-case basis. I have a hard time imagining that kind of a use either being a covered action if it's at that kind of scale, or coming to the council on appeal, because I don't think it would raise a significant impact on the co-equal goals or, be in substantial conflict with this policy. I mean, that's why we're trying to focus on limiting the loss of rural land to the greatest extent practical. That's why we have the purpose statement at the beginning of the policy.
Well, just let me, again, I didn't want to interrupt your presentation, but we need, serving versus specifying. Again, I don't just disagree at all with the processing of the crops and allowing those facilities as a part of it. But again, one can take a drive through Delta today, and they're not just the mom and pops. I mean, you can see trucking firms that are located. You can see agricultural suppliers, and they're actually, at least, again, my familiarity with Sacramento County Zoning Code, we allow those in ag zones. They may not just be, again, Joe with a tractor and a rig. They may be John Taylor Fertilizers or XYZ, supplier. Again, Randy knows all those probably far better than I, but you can, and they're located because their proximity is important. And whether it's in the legacy towns or dotted throughout the Delta, you've got some of those. And to say that no longer would those be consistent, and you can recognize the ones that are there, but I think it shuts a very important door, I guess. Okay. And I wanted to raise that because I think the commission, we didn't get into all the detail behind it, but I think the intent is certainly those things that legitimately support the agricultural productivity, including, the wineries. That was a very important one because we're seeing that higher value crop more and more, in certainly regions of the Delta elsewhere in California. But I would just point that out again as we're going through this today, and for my colleagues. That's one of those things where, again, it's not to, start eating up rural land or agricultural land, but some of those, and we haven't seen a lot of growth in those, but there are some that are much bigger because they do support the agricultural ongoing operations, and a lot of times seasonally and sometimes year-round in areas in the Delta. And I think it's important, again, you might want to encourage them where you've got sewer connections, either in the townships or, in city areas and so forth that maybe don't have the same flood risk. On the other hand, realities are you're going to have some of these operations in the Delta, and I think we want to encourage them to some extent because they're going to be supportive of agriculture. Anyway.
Other questions, Pat?
Just on the construction of the policy, Hank suggested, and I agree with him, that there might be clarity in beginning the policy, new urban development. In other words, what is the policy? And then in order to limit the loss of rural land, sort of as a justification for it, and I think that might even just be a separate sentence for clarity. So you have one sentence, it's long enough as it is. It goes from new urban development to legacy communities, period. And the purpose of this policy or the intent is to limit the loss of rural land and so forth.
Sure. That's an easy construction to take. And again, the reason we were wanting to do this is in part because of our responsibility to protect the Delta as a place. Certainly those rural open agricultural lands are a key feature of the Delta landscape. One thing that really struck me as we were putting together the map of the Delta plan that we've included in your packet is the important green belts that separate Tracy from the developed portions of Costa County, the very narrow now green belt between Stockton and Lathrop, and then the farmlands that are along the east side of the Delta between Elk Grove and Stockton. And, of course, one of the things that happens when that urbanization occurs, and Stockton especially you can see as you drive through there, is that not only are people building in areas that are probably over the long haul going to be exposed to flood hazards as the bay rises, as the Delta rises, but some of these are areas that I remember when they were planned for habitat restoration not that long ago because they were great sites. And those restoration opportunities have been lost now because in the intervening years, developments occurred. So this would be a policy that would say, hey, there's a lot of good reasons to put development in town. We know we've got a lot of land in the cities that's available for development. The sustainable community strategy that's just been developed for Sacramento County shows that they can accommodate all the population that's forecast, including meeting all their affordable housing needs over the next 20 years without intruding into the agricultural areas of the Delta. And we did an analysis of the vacant lands in San Joaquin County, and it showed that if they continue to develop at the paces they have over the last 20 years, they've got enough land within their spheres of influence to do the same. It's also a response to the requirement of Section 85022C2 of the Reform Act that we propose measures that would provide permanent protection of natural and scenic resources. So we're trying to respond to the DPC's proposal, make sure areas have got enough room to grow and meet their economic needs, while also making sure we keep lands for agriculture and minimize flood risks and don't lose more restoration.
Question, Dan, this is a helpful map. The areas of spheres of influence, it looks like there aren't, am I correct, there aren't any in Yolo County or in Contra Costa County? And in Sacramento County, it looks very small, and Don, you could probably tell me whether that's actually sphere of influence by Freeport.
Yeah, I think it's right there by the water tower.
Yeah.
I believe right there where the water tower is.
Yeah.
Just north of the town of Freeport.
Right. So that the spheres of influence seem to be, at least in this map, in San Joaquin County, around Tracy and Lathrop and Stockton, and Lodi really, I can't quite be sure of that. No, I think that's Stockton too. So, in some cases, I think those spheres of influence are actually already developed, incorporated, unincorporated.
Yeah, that's likely, I would think.
And the crosshatched is a sphere of influence, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it varies the reason a municipality would, and this is looking at municipal spheres of influence, and a reason they might identify a sphere of influence, it might be because they anticipate developing and extending services to it, and so they want to control how it develops so they can do that efficiently. It might also be that they're actually wanting to be in their sphere of influence so they can prevent somebody else from encouraging development there. And so I know, for example, that if you look on the west side of Sassoon Marsh, you can see west of 780 there, you've got the Benicia sphere of influence moving north out of the city of Benicia to cover that little bit of ag land that's inside the Sassoon Marsh and inside our area of responsibility, but is also green. And that was the thing that the city of Benicia did, because they were wanting to keep that open. It was an important greenbelt for the city, and they were concerned that Fairfield, moving down from the north, would plan for its development, and so they put it into their sphere of influence so they could protect it as part of an overall settlement of land use disputes in that area.
I don't know that area except driving on a freeway, but is that not urbanized already or slated for it between Pittsburgh and Martinez there, or there's some hills there? Are they sensitive areas? Are they important to the Delta?
I had not noticed that. This map was compiled from maps that were used in the environmental impact report. So there are layers that were obtained by our consultant from the entities that are involved. We can go back and check on that for sure.
No, I was just trying to get clarity. I want to know whether the general conclusion is that in what's covered by this policy, the use of the spheres of influence does not materially add to the footprint for urbanizing the Delta.
I couldn't assure you of that now, and that's something we can find out before we come back if that's important. What I was trying to do was accept what I thought was a policy direction that you were setting in other policies, that the spheres of influence were going to be exempted from the policy that protects restoration opportunities, exempted from the policy that requires 200-year flood protection. And so I was like, okay, this is a reasonable apportionment of acceptance of what's happened already.
I'm actually not
Yeah.
disputing the policy,
Yeah.
but what we found after the passage of the Delta Protection Act was that some people, most notably a former mayor of Stockton who appeared before the Delta Protection Commission, argued that the state was instructing local governments to build in the secondary zone. And that was the purpose for its creation, which seemed to, flip the understanding that some of us had in the passage of it. But you could take that view. You said, well, if the state thinks that the primary zone is important to protect, it must think that the other part is available for development, which it is, but that's not the same thing as say that it should be developed. It just reserves to local government the right to make those decisions unencumbered by all the restrictions that apply in the primary zone. So my only point here is that if sphere of influence, which I would agree, fits and is consistent with what we want, and if it is relatively small areas already that don't present any controversy about their eventual development, then that's fine. If they did, we may want to consider some additional statement that the deference to local government for spheres of influence does not presuppose their suitability for development.
I think that would be appropriate. In just thinking about it, one of the areas I know, for example, that's inside Stockton's sphere of influence that isn't planned for development by the city is the undeveloped portions of the Wright Elmwood Tract, which are low-lying, flood-prone, suitable for restoration, and planned for recreation in the city's plan, though they do have other owners or not public agencies now. And so I certainly wouldn't be my intention to say, hey, that's a great place for housing. It's just to say this is the footprint for municipalities that we're anticipating, and the areas that are green on this map we would expect to stay in agriculture.
Don?
Yeah, just kind of want to go back to the language and kind of the genesis of it, and understanding you're trying to find some, I guess, common ground, so to speak, here. But it starts out to limit the loss of rural land. And Dan, you pointed out that you were drawing off of the Commission's recommendation relative to protection of agricultural land. That paragraph not once does it say anything about protecting agricultural land there. Okay. And if that's the actual intent, I mean, rural setting is nice, but we were talking about concerning some of the things that are important to the rural setting, agricultural being the backbone of that, obviously recreation being another component. I think that's important to point out, because that's the essence of what we're talking about here, and it doesn't say that. And the other thing is the loss of rural land. If you change that, you don't lose the land. You're may convert it to a different use, and I mean it's the conversion basically to whether it's to an urban use or to some other use. And I understand the premise, and maybe just be the choice of words there, but. And I wanted to make that point because the economic sustainability plan, again, it doesn't talk about the economics here. I mean, maybe it's understood in our conversation, and that was part of it, that if you were going to protect and preserve certainly the character, but that, at least in good part, being agriculture and agricultural pursuits, then it was important to recognize that, and that's and the Commission looked at it, that ecosystem restoration could have an impact on that. Obviously, urbanization could have an impact on that. Significant flood risk, and again, I think we recognize certainly levees being important, so that was, again, built into some of our considerations as well. And that was balanced, and I think you've attempted, again, this is certain to credit that, with legacy towns or municipalities, the fact that, people that, live on the land or work the land depend upon other activities, both within the area of the Delta, but also obviously in the perimeter areas. And so I know you try to bundle a lot up here, but I think the economic sustainability piece of that was really important. It's because the long-term viability of agriculture, I think that was the findings, at least in part in our report that was certainly forwarded to this council, was that there's room for ecosystem restoration, maybe not to the degree this envisioned in some people's minds, without damaging agriculture, because there is conversion to higher value crops, there's efficiency being found, but the criticality of having services and suppliers and a workforce either in and or proximate to the Delta is very critical to that equation. And so, this talks to new development in, wise location of that. And I don't want to get, have that lost, at least in what you're trying to convey here. But I wanted to put those points out there because I think somehow, if you're going to take the essence of what the commission was bringing forward, even if there's disagreement about maybe the language that we felt pretty strong about, I think some of those elements, as you're looking at either rewriting or for this council's consideration anyway, in my view, to maybe bring those forward again without getting too wordy on it. So I'm offered that as a constructive, kind of critique of that.
Certainly, when you see the full text of this chapter, it's a real strong emphasis on protection of agriculture and the agricultural economy. One way that we could accommodate that would be quite simple, I think, is accepting Mr. Johnson's suggestion that we move the purpose statement kind of to the tail end of this provision. Why we could add very easily in there that one of the reasons we want to limit the loss of rural land to the greatest extent practical is to protect agriculture and the farm economy. That'd be easy to do, and it certainly was one of the things we were thinking about.
Well, that's right. Okay, that would be helpful. Thanks.
Let me just weigh in on that. I think Hank's suggestion that Pat echoed of changing the order to sentence is a good one. I assume you're going to start with new urban development?
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing I'd note, this last paragraph doesn't work with the first paragraph very well. First of all, you repeat all the limitations. As I understand this last paragraph, it's designed to indicate that in areas outside of the city sphere of influence, city limits provisions, that some activities are permitted. Commercial recreation facilities, industrial, commercial uses to process crops, right? Okay, now note, in your first paragraph you say local crops. You do not say local crops in the second paragraph. I assumed you meant to, because that's what you said going into it. But the other thing is, the word industrial is not replicated quite in the same way. I'm just telling you, as written, it is not clear that it is an industrial to uses to process local crops. It's almost a standalone word, industrial. Is that your intent?
Well, in thinking about that, we were trying to make sure that I was thinking about manufacturing uses. When I think of an industrial food processing thing, I go, that's a manufacturing use. In my mind, that was industrial. Tomato cannery. I think it's unlikely that anybody would build a new tomato cannery in the Delta, but to me, that's an industrial use that is about processing local crops. A commercial use might be some of the kinds of things that Don's talked about. I remember back in the day in Davis when we used to have a place that was primarily just a sorting area for crops that came in from the field, and then they were repackaged, resorted to go to other processors. They did a lot of tomato moving stuff like that in that area. So I was thinking of that.
Well, this is undoubtedly pedantic, but on the last sentence, it does not cover visitor serving commercial recreation facilities, nor industrial or commercial uses to process local crops. I defer to Chris on this language, but there's been litigation about just exactly this kind of wording, and I do not want an open invitation, because you don't draw a distinction between the primary and the secondary zone. Somebody walks in and say, well, you've written it. It says industrial use in the rest of the Delta is okay. which I do not intend.
Yeah, I
to
don't
support.
intend that either, and if I have the permission to ask a question, and it's only just to get the intention so we can
Yeah.
tighten this up, but in the first paragraph, what you talk about is, and it's not you, what we talk about as staff is restricting to areas that current city and county general plans designate for development in cities, their spheres of influence, or legacy communities. So a couple things. The first thing is we're talking about current city and county general plans. So we're not trying to go back and invalidate or change any kind of current city and county plans, right? That's
No.
one foundational point. But with respect to the fact that we're trying to limit to areas that those current plans designate for development in cities, spheres of influence, or legacy communities, that sort of implies that there are areas in cities, spheres of influence, or legacy communities that aren't planned currently under those general plans for development. Does that mean, well, first of all, are there those areas? And second of all, if there are, does that mean that we're trying to prohibit the development in those areas? So for instance, in a sphere of influence, is there a carve-out where, do you understand where I'm going down?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it doesn't match with the second paragraph, which says the policy's only going to apply to proposed actions that are outside of those areas. So are there any inside of those areas that we're trying to address?
I wasn't thinking at that level of detail. There certainly are areas that are not planned for development inside the spheres of influence of several of these communities. And as again, I talked about Stockton's right Elmwood tract, plans for a park. The agricultural areas that are on the open space lands that are north of Benicia that are plans for continued open space and agricultural use.
So would it be cleaner than just to, if the policy direction is to just focus on areas outside of those three, to not worry about where development is currently planned, or in any event, we should take a look and rethink the language because those two paragraphs don't match.
I think as long as we're clear on intent, I think we can fine tune the text.
I want to circle back to the other language. Tell me what limit, if any, is imposed by the language visitor serving commercial recreation facilities.
Well,
that's not a phrase I recognize immediately, but it sounds like the kind of thing planners say.
yeah, no, it's. I'm familiar with it because it's part of the Coastal Act that gives an exception for locations of development, so you can put visitor serving.
Yeah, but the difference with the Coastal Act is we have no guarantee that every project approval will automatically come here.
Sure. And they don't either. So, but a good example is in Sacramento County's general plan, and we go and we can look at the maps of the legacy communities, and they have a recreation zone, I believe, that they apply to marinas and other uses that are
Delta Waterways
along the waterfront,
Delta Waterways
and so that would be an example of that in the Contra Costa general plan and the map of Bethel Island. You see they have areas where their marinas are that they designate for commercial recreation. So each local government is probably going to have their own formulation of that, And again, I think that would be general direction that we're providing about the nature of uses. I think you could clearly see a Walmart isn't a visitor serving recreation facility, even though they let campers stay overnight in their parking lots.
Why isn't it under this definition?
Why is it? Because its primary purpose is not to serve visitors. If you have got
But it doesn't. Primary purpose is not used in this language.
If what you're suggesting is we should add a definition.
No, what concerns me more than anything is by not recognizing the difference between a primary and a secondary zone on permitted development, it appears to me that we are making more possible development in the primary zone of a visitor serving commercial recreation facility nature or an industrial nature, or a commercial uses to process now local crops nature. And you got to sell me on that idea.
Well, I think nothing that we're doing would do anything to remove the restrictions that are in the Delta Protection Act or in the DPC's Natural Resources Land Use Management.
Well, but if we adopt a Delta plan with the language that stands here, could the Delta Protection Commission automatically conform to it by changing their current policies? I would assume so.
Well, they would still be subject as well to the restrictions in their own act.
Yeah, but we are, by using the notion of protecting city limits and spheres of influence, I understand that we're essentially giving permission for these kinds of activities, but it's the others ones where it's not a city limits, it's not a sphere of influence, it's just out there. I read this as creating a presumption of validity. So, for example, is the county of Sacramento required to approve a proposal being submitted within their unincorporated area, but outside with a different use than their current plan that meets these tests?
There would be, I think, say, I came in, I wanted to put a gift shop take an old farmstead and turn it into a gift shop and rent kayaks. There's nothing that would require Sacramento County to approve it in here that would require them to approve that. It's not that affirmative language that says you must locate these things.
But they're required to be consistent with the Delta plan.
That's an easy fix. We can clarify
and that's
that.
why this policy is directed at where new urban development should go.
Well,
the policy is about where should you put new urban development. Don't put it out in the country.
I'm with
Except
you.
for these things. You
Listen,
can put them in the country if you want.
I'm with you on the first paragraph.
Yeah.
I don't have any questions about that. But undefined categories in the remainder of the statutory delta in the Suisun Marsh, undefined, bothers me.
Well, we can easily add a definition of visitor serving commercial recreational facilities. That would be easy to do, and that would put some constraints on it so it would be clear it's not a bowling alley.
Mr. Chair, if I just maybe weigh in, I think a good example again would be, and it's not a legacy community, but it's the Delta Loop, the Brandon Anderson. We have a special plan area. Conforms with Delta waterways. It also conforms with the agricultural zoning that's on the land side, but allows for marinas. Yet it requires a use permit, but restaurants, some overnight facilities, campgrounds, and RV spaces and so forth. Again, all those are subject to use permit to going through the local land use. And we haven't seen any of those, probably in the last decade, any new ones come through. But that's an area where that's would be allowed. It would be outside, obviously, a legacy community outside a sphere of influence. It would be adjacent to a rural area, but by our general plan, and again, each individual development would be judged on its own merits and be subject to discretionary action, but are generally compatible with other uses. Now, we also recognize, I'll just say this, is that, and I think other counties have as well, that going back as far back as probably 20 years ago, that because of some of the concerns about evacuation risk and so forth, in the event there was something that occurred, they're required to submit plans for how they would move people out and to notify folks who would be there overnight or longer. How much of that goes on in practical terms, I mean, that's probably a mixed bag. But we recognize that, and that's been recognized in both our general plan and in even the use permits, where have certain requirements for where they would move to high ground in the event that there were some sort of an event that would require quick removal of people and equipment. So, but those are areas that are they're commercial in nature, and we actually have a CO zone, this commercial recreation zone that that the marinas actually fall within that if they aren't in an SPA or in the Delta Waterway zone. So I think those are just some examples. Other counties probably have similar where they have marina areas, and yet they're in most part compatible with the agricultural operations that go on right immediately adjacent to some of those some of those activities.
Pat?